Hello, I'm Michael Rothberg, and on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies featuring Professor Susanne Knittel. Today's event is entitled The Question Concerning Perpetrators. I'm grateful, as always, to the Leve Center staff for making these events possible, and we at the center would like to thank you, the viewers, for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. So before we begin our discussion, let me just introduce Professor Knittel. Susanne Knittel is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Her research centers on the question of how societies remember atrocities, and specifically how they deal with the uncomfortable issues of guilt and responsibility, and what role literature, art, film, and other cultural representations play in this process. Her first book, The Historical Uncanny, Disability, Ethnicity, and the Politics of Holocaust Memory, was published by Fordham University Press in 2015, and it was translated into German in 2018 by Transcript Press. And The Historical Uncanny is a comparative analysis of German and Italian Holocaust memory, focusing on the difficult memories of the Nazi euthanasia program and of Italian fascist eugenic racism. It's a very original study. Her second project, Faces of Evil, which was funded by the Dutch Research Council, focused on the role and representation of perpetrators in contemporary memory culture. In the context of that project, she founded the Perpetrator Studies Network, which connects scholars across the humanities, social sciences, law, and psychology, as well as curators, artists, and educators from Europe and around the world. She's also co-edited the Routledge International Handbook of Perpetrator Studies, which came out in 2019, and she co-founded the peer-reviewed open access journal, JPR, the Journal of Perpetrator Research. So welcome, Susanne. I've been following your work, as you know, for quite some time, and it's great to have this opportunity to talk about it with you. And I thought we should start with a kind of basic question, which is about this field called perpetrator studies, which is a relatively new field, in fact. So could you tell us what we mean when we talk about perpetrator studies, and when and why it emerged? You know, why should we look at perpetrators specifically?
Thank you, Michael. Well, thanks first of all for inviting me. Thanks also to the Leve Center. I'm very, very excited about having this conversation with you. And this is a great first question to get us started and warmed up. So over the past 2 decades, we've seen in scholarship on the one hand, but also in public discourse and in the cultural sphere especially, what one could call a turn to the figure of the perpetrator. Now, of course, there's always been interest in those who committed atrocities and fascination, really. But starting in the 1990s, in the context of the genocides in Rwanda, in the former Yugoslavia, for example, and especially also with 9/11, the so-called war on terror, and the very recent and ongoing wars, like the war in Syria, we see an increased preoccupation with the perpetrators and with perpetration of mass atrocities and collective violence, and the dynamics of collective violence in different arenas and in different disciplines. So, for example, thinking about the legal context, we've seen important developments in terms of how criminal justice systems approach mass crimes. So think, for example, of the establishment of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and tribunals like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia or for Rwanda, or the one in Cambodia. And these trials really have enabled also a comparative study and have provided the framework for a comparative study of perpetrators and perpetration beyond the legal framework. Now, at the same time, we've seen in civic education and also genocide prevention, a greater recognition of the importance of looking at perpetrators, right? I mean, these discourses have been dominated by the figure of the victim or the figure of the survivor or the witness, but we cannot learn about the conditions in which something like a genocide becomes possible by looking at the victims alone. And so school education, civic education, police training, for example, are increasingly including modules on the question of the perpetrator and on the question of participation in violence, and bystanders, of course, also. And also sites of memory, right, are sites of civic education, and museums are developing, interestingly, special exhibitions on the perpetrators. And they address questions of choice, of agency, complicity in educational programs and in these exhibitions. So on the one hand, we have this preventive aspect of looking at perpetrators. And so people would be focusing on question of how does one become a perpetrator? What are the motivations and constraints that lead people to participate in violence? What are different subject positions in relation to mass violence? And scholars also have increasingly started looking at the complexity, the intersectionality, one could say, of perpetrators, right? That different systems of violence and injustice interlock and come together, and how, of course, the individual occupies a complicated and changing position in these systems. And then also that violence is dynamic, it changes, and you can change your mind also about participating in this violence. So all of these things have been now receiving a lot of scholarly attention. Now, there's another important aspect, and that's really the one that I'm more interested in my own work, because, of course, in the context of memory studies, right? And that's the question of accountability and reconciliation, or reparation and memory. And so in that context, engaging with the perpetrators is necessary for coming to terms with past atrocities in the present. How do we think about these past atrocities in the present? It's important for divided societies to be able to move forward, of course, and for thinking about how societies deal with questions of guilt and responsibility. And so the questions in that context are sort of, what role do perpetrators play in collective memory and memory politics, and how do societies come to terms with the perpetrators in their midst, so to speak, right? And both of these, right, the preventive and sort of the accountability aspect have gone importantly, and I think that's also one of the points that is different in the interest of in perpetrators these days, with very much with a deconstruction of the category of the perpetrator, right? And questioning the very term and usefulness of the term of the perpetrator. And together with that, of course, we've had the deconstruction of these binaries, victim, perpetrator, etc., right? Heroes versus villains, good versus evil, right? And so in this context, the cultural sphere plays a very important role, right? Because that's where these things are played out, in a sense, in theater, in art, in documentary filmmaking, for example, and in literature, very importantly. We see very nuanced engagements now with the point of view of the perpetrators, right? And that has been for a very long time more of a troubled or taboo subject. So how do perpetrators think about their own actions and justify them, maybe to themselves? How do they present their motivations, right? And so cultural representations can really enhance our understanding of the complexities of participation in violence. And they challenge us to reflect also on the role of representation and culture in constructing and dismantling the figure of the perpetrator. So all of these issues are at the heart of perpetrator studies as a field, as I think about it. It's really a super interdisciplinary field. You've already mentioned the various disciplines that are really sort of engaged in looking at this figure of the perpetrator. One of the most important things, I think, to understand about the field, as I conceive of it, as at least, is really this critical interrogation of the very category of the perpetrator, right? It is, in a sense, an essentially contested concept, the perpetrator, right? Very much like the concept of genocide for genocide studies or memory for memory studies, the point isn't to come up with one final definition, this or that is a perpetrator, but rather to keep asking critical questions about it. And to think about also the ethical stakes that are involved in what does it mean to study perpetrators, right? Of course, this is an ethical conundrum also. So also a meta-reflection on what we are doing as scholars when we are looking at perpetrators. And of course, answering the question, why look at perpetrators, in also that process of engaging with them. So what makes it a field to my mind is that there's a lot of cross-disciplinary conversation now going on. And our journal, JPR, is one platform where this is happening. And also there's sort of a set of key reference points and texts, foundational texts almost, that has been developed, or rather that people keep referring to when they write about perpetrators, which is also, I think, what makes it a field in a way.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a really useful sketch of the emergence of this field and some of its main points of reference. So you're saying on the one hand that the point of the field in a way is to contest the figure of the category of the perpetrator, but on the other hand, there are a set of kind of shared reference points and concepts that hold the field together, if I'm understanding you correctly. So could you say a little bit more about what some of those shared concepts and reference points are?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, right. Also the shared and in a sense also contested, because people keep returning to them and challenging them and reworking them and developing them further. And so this is also, they form the basis really of the interdisciplinary conversation, because this conversation is difficult, of course, talking across different disciplines, right? So the way I always look at the field, and a lot of my colleagues do as well, is that really it's sort of theoretical and conceptual foundations are really in the study of the Holocaust and its perpetrators. And of course, genocide and mass violence are, have been around before the Holocaust and have been around since. But it's really interesting that after 1945, people started theorizing the questions around perpetrators much more systematically and deeply, I think. And so the obvious starting points really for the discussion are the Nuremberg trials, right, on the one hand, and a very important other reference point is the Eichmann trial. The Nuremberg trial, of course, saw the first large-scale investigations into the psyche and motivations of the perpetrators, which is still important, right? And they also shaped the discourse on legal and moral accountability and crimes against humanity, of course, a concept that was coined in response to the Holocaust. The Eichmann trial is, of course, important because of Hannah Arendt's influential and controversial interpretation of Eichmann as an example of what she called the banality of evil. And Arendt's interpretation centered on an evil that was at the same time radical in its consequences and banal in its perpetrators, right? The thoughtlessness that she describes with Eichmann is very important. And her observations sort of dovetailed also with a number of experiments, psychological experiments, right? The obedience to authority experiments by Stanley Milgram and the Stanford prison experiments by Philip Zimbardo, right? And those and a host of other scholars did not believe, Arendt, Milgram, and Zimbardo, they did not believe that the perpetration of evil acts can be simply explained in terms of personality or sadism or other dispositions, but rather that evil is something people are capable of depending on situational factors like peer pressure or obedience to authority, dehumanization of the victims, also distancing from the victims, and rationalization of their actions, among others, right? And the most notable application of these ideas and theories to the study of the Holocaust came in 1992, of course, with Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, which famously investigated the Reserve Police Battalion 101 and its role in the mass murder of thousands of Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland. Now, this book really changed the conversation about perpetrators and perpetrator motives fundamentally. Browning actually draws on Milgram and explains the participation of the reserve policemen from the Hamburg area, most of them not particularly noticeable for any anti-Semitic or pre-existing dedication to the Nazi cause. And he explains that their behavior with combination of careerism, obedience, peer pressure, the brutalization of war, getting used to the killing, etc. Now, really, this study is just absolutely remarkable, and it is based on the testimonies, right, on the perpetrators' testimonies of 125 men, and these testimonies were given in the context of legal proceedings about 20 years after the events. And so he had to take into account all kinds of, memory fallibility, repression, denial, outright lies, right, exculpation. But nonetheless, and he does, right, it's a masterful, investigation of also the problem of perpetrator testimony. And he nonetheless comes to these extremely astonishing, almost like thick descriptions of especially the beginning, the first day, because that seems to be what's stuck in their memory a lot, right? The first time they had to do it. And that really gives insights in how these various participants experience the events. And so the term ordinariness, or the concept of ordinariness, is absolutely a key one here. And in the handbook that I edited with Zach Goldberg, we have a whole section that deals with these key concepts and key reference points, and also revisit them in light of now, right? But it also shows how scholars have taken them to other contexts and challenged them and developed them further. And that's what's exciting, right? Especially, of course, through the lens of non-Western contexts and cases, how people have taken up these studies and concepts. But somehow, everybody comes back to ordinariness or banality of evil. So.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking about Browning, I was thinking back myself and realizing that reading Browning was really one of the things that inspired me to go into Holocaust studies, right? And I wonder would you say that this is in some way, I mean, obviously there was, as you said, the interest in perpetrators goes back further. There's the Nuremberg trials. There's certainly the Eichmann trial and Arendt, the controversy around the notion of the banality of evil and Hannah Arendt. I mean, would you say, though, that as a field, like that Browning's book is the origin of this recent field of perpetrator studies, that it sort of follows from that?
Totally. Yeah, because it really is it doesn't focus on the leaders. Not that perpetrator studies is not interested in leaders, but it's interested in all levels, right? I mean, and in especially the question also, why is this relevant for us? Why is this relevant for absolutely everybody? So I think, and this is, he even says that, right? When I think about it, what would I have done, right? And this is ultimately the question that perpetrator studies has to ask and tackle with, and absolutely, I think it's huge, this text. Absolutely.
Yeah, so these are obviously such compelling and important questions. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And so it's not surprising that people like you or people like me would become our students are always interested in these kinds of issues. But I am also curious to hear a little bit more, like personally, in a sense, like how did you become interested in perpetrators? And then also, but on an intellectual level, how does your work fit into this field that you have just sketched in such a compelling fashion?
Yeah, so my interest actually started with the research for my first book, which also was my dissertation, so quite a while ago. And this book, as you already said, is a comparative study of post-World War II German and Italian memory culture, and focuses on the very difficult and marginalized memories of the Nazi euthanasia program, which was the extermination of people with supposedly hereditary illnesses and disabilities by the Nazis, and in Germany. And in Italy, it focuses on the fascist persecution of Slovenes and Croats, and also Jews in the region of northeastern Italy, so in and around the city of Trieste. Now, both of these aspects of the Nazi and fascist past have been basically marginalized, ignored in memory culture and in scholarly discourse on the Holocaust until recently. And so the point of departure really for my book was my puzzlement about why this was the case. And so in the book, I investigate some of the reasons for this marginalization. And just very briefly, in Germany, Nazi euthanasia was forgotten, for example, because it was regarded as a medical issue. So the victims of the euthanasia killings were, for the longest time, until about 10 years ago or so, not seen as victims of racial or religious or political persecution, and thus not included in most of the court cases, the reparations programs, or the commemorations for that matter. And so essentially, their killing was seen as a medical aberration. And that, of course, completely neglects the context of the international eugenics movement and the important role the eugenics movement played for both the Nazis and also the fascists, actually, right? Eugenics was super influential in many European countries, in Germany and Italy also very much, of course, also in the US at the turn of the century, and had reached its peak also in the interwar period, right after World War I. And so in a sense, also the eugenics movement is forgotten or repressed in both contexts, in Germany and in Italy. And in Italy, of course, the forgotten or repressed memories are also, and connected to that, the Italian fascist crimes in Italy, but also in the occupied territories like the former Yugoslavia or in the colonies, right? And a major factor in the forgetting of these or repressing of these legacies is that the exclusion and marginalization of the people, like people with mental illnesses and disabilities or ethnic minorities, is of course continuing, if in different guises, right? And so there also the question of ongoing structural injustice is a factor in the forgetting of these memories. And so cultural representations in my book play a huge role in bringing these forgotten victims' stories back into circulation and these memories. And I show in my book how theater, literature, and films, and especially also grassroots commemorative initiatives actually start changing the conversation about these victims and about this memory. But, and here we come to the perpetrators. So my book takes as a grounding and a point of departure two sites of memory, one in Germany and one in Italy. Let me show you some pictures of them. The one, and this, as you see here in the picture, is the former Nazi euthanasia killing center Grafeneck in southern Germany. And this is an old castle, which used to be a home for people with disabilities before the Nazis seized it and turned it into a killing center. And then after the end of the war, it became again a home for people with disabilities and mental illnesses. And it also became a memorial site dedicated to the victims of Nazi euthanasia. And the other memorial is this. This is the Risiera di San Sabba Memorial in Trieste, which used to be a rice husking factory before the war. and was then turned into a deportation and killing camp set up by the Nazi occupiers in 1943. And its victims were mainly Jewish and anti-fascists, Jewish people and anti-fascists, partisans, Slovenes and Croats, but also actually patients, Jewish patients of hospitals and asylums in the region. Now, at first glance, those two sites, especially if you look at the victims, they don't have all that much in common, right? But the breakthrough in my research really came when I realized that it was the same perpetrators who organized and oversaw the killings, both in Grafeneck and at the Riziera. So there was a whole group of men who were basically trained in the euthanasia program in Grafeneck and other killing centers in Germany and Austria, and were then sent to Poland, where they set up and ran the Aktion Reinhardt death camps, right? Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. And then after that, they were sent to Trieste to set up and run the Riziera di San Saba. And so, in other words, right, while, on the surface, looking at the victims, there is no real connection between these two sides. If you look at the perpetrators, there's a direct line that runs from one to the other. And right, these perpetrators basically had become experts in extermination. And so it depends on what you look at. The framework from memory studies and Holocaust studies, of course, and the main point of my book was to recover these victims' stories and show how, they are being commemorated. But to find actually the connection, I had to look at the perpetrators. And so the perpetrators basically form a bridge between my two parts of the book, the part about Germany and the part about Italy. And I want to show you just very briefly to get a sense also of what this discovery enabled me to look at also, right? Because if it's the same group of perpetrators at both sides, that enables a direct comparison also in how they are represented in the exhibitions, for example, and in memory culture more broadly. And so this is what I explore in sort of the central chapter in my book. So here, for example, you see Christian Wirth, one of the perpetrators. He was a Stuttgart policeman and was first in charge of the administration at Grafeneck. Then he became the Inspector General of the Aktion Reinhardt camps in Poland. And then he was the commandant of the Riziera in Trieste. And on the left, you see how he's pictured at the Grafeneck Memorial. And on the right, you see how he's pictured at the Riziera Memorial. And I talk about how the way these photos were chosen and also the way he's pictured in the exhibition says a lot about how these sites conceive of the perpetrators, right? You have sort of an official portrait, right? Sort of very much it's an ID, I think, picture, very much the ordinary guy kind of image. Whereas in the other picture, you have, of course, the paraphernalia, the Nazi uniform, and it's more sort of an outdoor action shot. He's got, which you can't see right now, I guess it's cut off. He's got binoculars even, right? So these surveillance instruments, right? So, and this is from taken in Poland, right? This is from the 1940s. So this is 10 years later. And so I talk about how the display of these perpetrators says something also about how they are presented, right? So in the German exhibition, which is from 2005, it's very much sort of they were from the middle of society. And in Italy, it's very much, they were basically extraterrestrials almost, right? They came from Germany and then they went away again and they did horrible things that had nothing to do with us, sort of. Yeah, so let me stop sharing here. Yes.
So yeah, it's a really fascinating story. And I remember when I first read your work and saw that, okay, you're juxtaposing, this euthanasia site in Germany with this kind of fascist site in Italy, and thinking like, how is she going to bring those together? How are these two things actually connected? And then realizing that the link is precisely through the perpetrators themselves. And it's kind of, I mean, it's incredibly illuminating comparison, I think.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to shift gears a little bit,
Yeah.
Earlier you talked about how there's been this kind of large scale turn to the perpetrators, and we've talked a lot about the scholarship so far, but it's also a phenomena, as you mentioned, that you see in popular culture or in cultural production more generally. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit and maybe give some specific examples of how we see a turn to the perpetrator in the cultural sphere?
Yes. Well, there's a lot. There's a lot going on, and I can't. I'm gonna focus on just sort of particular type of cultural representation. But yeah, I mean, right? It's noticeable in mainstream representations and also in more experimental works and genres. I mean, it really, to my mind, it started in the early 2000s, but it's never so neat, of course, right? But you get films like, for example, The Downfall from 2004, which is a fictional depiction of the last days in Hitler's bunker. Or you get Jonathan Littell's The Kindly Ones, this novel that is written from the perspective, right? First person narrative of an SS officer. And both of these push the boundaries really of, at the time, especially of what, of how, Nazi perpetrators were represented, and sparked huge debates, of course, not only in Germany about, the ethics of this perpetrator representation, but, and lots, of course, has been written about these. But what I find really, I mean, one trend really I find extremely interesting is that in documentary film and in documentary theater, or I don't even know if I can call it documentary theater, we have a turn to, or we have an engagement with, increased engagement with perpetrator documents, really the words of perpetrators and scholarship about perpetrators. And now, in theater, of course, that goes further back. We have this in the 60s in Germany, but there's definitely something different going on right now, because a lot of this also involves reenactment. A particularly interesting example is Stefan Ruzowitzki's film Das Radikal Böse, Radical Evil, from 2014. Let me show you just the trailer to the film.
I thought I would be able to cope with the matter, and with or without me, the Jews would not be able to escape their fate.
Inwardly, I did not agree.
I must say that we didn't think about it at all at the time. Later on, after the men had gotten used to the bloodbath, there were always enough volunteers.
It's true that single members of the company were seized by some kind of bloodlust.
We had to do the dirty work.
What are we doing? Men, women, children, all wiped out. Dear Heidi, don't start worrying about it. It has to be done.
You might know Ruzowitzki from his Oscar-winning film The Counterfeiters, which is from 2007. And radical evil is, and the title here, of course, is an allusion to Hannah Arendt, and an ironic really take, I think, of that concept. The film is based on Browning's Ordinary Men, right? And other key studies in the field, for example, the Milgram obedience experiments and the Stanford prison experiment that I mentioned earlier. And the film really has sort of three layers or three components. And one is just sort of the standard expert interviews with psychologists or historians, including Browning himself. Another component is the reenactments of the experiments that are done sort of in minimal staging, right, on the floor with these lines on the floor, minimal props. And then the third component are these film sequences of actors portraying the police battalion that Browning discusses. And these actors are young men, young German actors, but basically unknown, and they don't speak in these scenes, right? What we hear is a voiceover that is spoken by other people, by actually quite well-known German actors, and they are reading out the letters or court testimony and other ego documents from these perpetrators. And so the voiceover and the acting is decoupled from each other, as is, of course, then also the experiments sort of resonate with the filmed or staged scenes, in the fact that these experiments are sort of very, minimally acted, whereas the other scenes are a little bit more acted, and then you have the talking heads. So it's a montage, and you can see in the when you see the faces, you always have the split screen where you see several faces next to each other. It sort of also emphasizes the way they are interchangeable, right? It's sort of an anonymized presentation of these ordinary men, right? Could be anybody. So that's what the film is sort of trying to do. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a de-emphasis of the individual and sort of more an emphasis on the anonymous ordinary guys who are trying to basically find their bearings. You can see how they start, how to say this, you can see the peer pressure, you can see how they are egging each other on, you can also see how they are getting used to it. But there's always this distancing moment, this, the effect of stagedness, of mediatedness, that and of montage, especially, that gives a distance to the events that are being seen. Mm-hmm. So it's a very didactic film in a sense, and in fact, the filmmaker has prepared educational materials. Right, he very much made this film with sort of high school education, other civic education in mind. And on the website, you can download educational materials to go with the film, for example.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I don't actually know that film, but it's fascinating. I will look for it.
Yeah.
It looks like it would go well, while teaching something like Browning, I suppose. I wonder, so how would you, relate that to a film that I'll say, for my part, I know better, and I've used in classes quite a bit, which is Joshua Oppenheimer's film, The Act of Killing, right, which is a film about the mass killings in Indonesia in 1965, where the state and the army basically killed between 500,000 and 1 million Indonesians who were either communists or suspected of being communists, so really political motivations. And Oppenheimer made this kind of incredible film where he actually gets some of the perpetrators themselves, the actual perpetrators, to stage and reenact their own crimes. And it's a very provocative and very disturbing film. And in some ways, these are, you see, very ordinary guys. These are pretty low-level perpetrators. These are not the ruling elites by any stretch of the imagination. And yet at the same time, they don't quite seem to fit into, the Browning mold of just ordinary men, because they really are kind of sadistic, I suppose, or at least that's the way they come through in the film. I'm just curious if you have thoughts about the act of killing and maybe like different modes in which perpetrators are being addressed in these sorts of works.
Yeah, no, it's great that you actually bring that up, because that's the other type of film that somehow there's also a trend here that you actually get documentary films that interview the actual perpetrators and get them to reenact their deeds, or that get them to return to the scene of the crime, or that even get them to talk to victims, right? Former victims or survivors. And what's interesting here, yes, is that, right, mediation and representation play such a huge role. While you have in the Ruzowitzki example, you have this sort of being done by the filmmaker, and it is made clear that what we are seeing here is a reenactment. We have that too in the Oppenheimer, but it has so many more layers, right? You have the documentary film that Oppenheimer's making, that you have the film that the perpetrators are making, right? He gets them to talk with him and to get excited about his film, because he invites them to make their own movie about their deeds, right? And it seems like they haven't, they feel like they need to, they feel like they want to and need to tell their story, because they somehow have been not recognized enough, their heroism in a sense, right? And so he gets them to set up their own movie, and they have been huge fans of American movies, like, musicals and westerns and gangster movies, right? And so the film they're making is a mixture of all of them. And then there's yet another layer of mediation that that Oppenheimer shows the takes, like the raw material that they're filming to them later on, right? Mm-hmm. When he's at home, they're looking at back at the day's work, right? So there's the film in the film in the film, sort of, and that creates this really incredibly interesting layering of mediation. And of course, what the film brings out over, extremely powerfully is the role that films and cultural representations play in the traveling of violence, right? Like torture methods. They watch gangster films and westerns to learn about and take their methods of torturing and killing from some of these films, right? And that also is another aspect that I find extremely interesting. But yeah, it's extremely provocative, because here you get not actors, but they themselves, and they are not only acting themselves in their film. They're not only playing themselves; they're also playing their victims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and other roles, right? And so there's like a key moment also when he's when he's being Anwar Congo, right? The one of the protagonists he's playing the victim, and he's being strangled, and then he has this moment of I think they try several times, right? And he cries, and he almost faints, and he really finds it extremely uncomfortable, and he says, I can't do it anymore. And then I think that is one of the moments when he realizes, oh, this what I did was really horrible, and this is how it felt, right? So you can see it doesn't, you're right, they don't connect to the order, or so straightforwardly to the ordinary paradigm, but what they do, I think, very much connect to is the banality of evil paradigm, because what you see is this thoughtlessness that I talked about earlier, right? They didn't bother, I guess, it seems, to think about what it felt like to be a victim, and in this reenactment, they somehow, through the bodily experience, I think, come to understand what it means in a way. Yeah. I don't know, how do you see the film?
That makes sense. I mean, I think memory plays an interesting role too, in a sense, in a collective sense, because it's impossible to imagine a film like this being made in, say, Germany, right? Or with Holocaust perpetrators. And why is that? It's because the Holocaust is widely recognized, first of all in Germany and then around the world, as an example of radical evil, right? To use that term again. And so nobody is going to, except the most extreme, far right neo-Nazi is going to, agree to make a film in which they joyously reenact their deeds, their perpetration. But in Indonesia, you have a situation in which the ruling regime is basically the same as the one that committed the genocide, or at least is closely enough tied to it. And there isn't a broad societal recognition and remembrance of these events as, again, evil or as wrong, at least in a kind of fundamental moral sense. And so it becomes, I guess, easier to do these sorts of reenactments. And it's a very different kind of memory, a memory which is, almost celebratory of perpetration, as opposed to this more critical form that you might find in the German or Holocaust context, I suppose.
Yeah. No, and I mean, what's really interesting is that they feel that they should be celebrated more by the government and by the people. And so let us tell you about our heroism and what we did, right? Also this sort of like, it had to be done and we were the ones doing it and you're not acknowledging this. And through the film, they think they can get this, but it of course completely backfires because what actually the film that in the end we watch is like a complete demontage really of these heroes, right? And I think they realize this too as they watch the takes of their own film. But it's also it's a very confusing viewing experience, right? There's these musical scenes that you don't know why on earth they're there, and I think that's also part of the point, right? That is the viewer sort of has to realizes this is not going to be an account of this genocide, right? It is going to be whatever the perpetrators think they were doing, and then also the sort of the moment for them to sort of maybe face. I mean, this is of course debated, right, in scholarship on the film, whether they actually have this moment of recognition and regret, or whether this is also something they are staging, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so it's clear that in the cultural realm, there are these, pretty radical, experimental new forms being developed to grapple with the whole question of perpetration in its various dimensions. Maybe sort of as a last question, we could go back to the realm of scholarship, and I'd be curious to hear where you think perpetrator studies as a field is going, right? So not just representations of perpetrators, but sort of more scholarly studies, and then how your own current work fits into that, and what you're working on these days. Yeah.
So I think the field, there's definitely, there's many different directions the field is going and can be going, but there's two developments that I find especially interesting. And that's also, it's been going on for a while. The one which is sort of and I said already sort of, right, the figure of the perpetrator is being deconstructed, and the binaries of victim and perpetrator are being deconstructed. And that's definitely where major and very important work is being done, is in sort of these in-between spaces, right? The question of complicity and accountability that goes beyond just the victim and the perpetrator, right? And so I really think that there's a field almost, or an area of inquiry around the concept of complicity and related concepts, of course, that has been really picking up again in also, the past 2 decades or so, at the intersection of memory studies and political philosophy, especially. And it's also an interdisciplinary field with people in memory studies, literary studies, including you, of course, and your work on implication, but also political science, etc., are working on the question of complicity and mass violence, and especially thinking about, questions of agency and sort of, finding also more distributive models, right? It's obvious that this is a much more complex scenario when we're talking about large scale or structural violence, right? That it's not so simple with, questions of intention, et cetera, et cetera. And also, of course, there's a tendency to has been to develop a much more nuanced and differentiated vocabulary around these questions, right? In which your concept of implication, of course, plays an important role. And so, also for your work, right, cultural representations here, I think, have an important role to play in helping us imagine the very complex ways in which people are complicit in or implicated in or involved in or participate in these mass scale, large scale and structural systems of violence. So that's one, I think, field or subfield that is definitely, blooming and has a lot of work that still has to be done, I think. And the other development is sort of more an ecological turn in fields like memory studies, but also genocide studies. And that's very important, I think, for perpetrator studies. And the field hasn't yet really gotten there, but is in the process of getting there, right? So in genocide studies, scholars have begun to pay attention to the destruction of the environment as an integral part of warfare and genocide, either in the run-up to warfare and genocide or during, right, as a part of strategy of warfare and genocide, and of course also in the aftermath of war and genocide. And some have even started theorizing and arguing that the genos in genocide must be redefined ecologically, right, to encompass humans, non-humans, and the environment, which I think is a very important way to think about it. So in my own work, I want to look a little bit, and so I'm developing a big research project which will look at the contemporary, so again, the time frame of the last 20 years, but the contemporary cultural imagination of the connections between genocide, colonialism, and ecocide. So I'm going to take, and especially also how these cultural representations reflect on the question of complicity and responsibility. And it will be, multimedial. I'll be looking at theater, at literature, at poetry, also film, and also museums and how they reflect on this. So at the moment I'm writing an article about German family novels, and right. So the family novel, of course, has been a key genre for investigating the involvement and the complicity of ordinary Germans, so to speak, in the history of the Holocaust and the legacy of this complicity or perpetration, right, across different generations, and how different generations deal with that, and also write about that. And it also, there are generation novels now, family novels, that also deal in a similar manner with the legacy of colonialism, also the cross-generational legacy of colonialism. But what's most interesting, and that's what my article is about, is that there are novels that not only combine the legacy of colonialism, the family legacy of colonialism, and the Holocaust, but also they put that in a broader framework of ecological violence, slow violence, as Rob Nixon calls it, and how colonialism, of course, through extraction, through species extinction, hunting, for example, and also the Holocaust and World War II, also through extraction. And hunting is definitely something that comes back in all of these novels, and how so you have, for example, you have the great grandfather who is was and the great grandfather's generation who were settlers in the German colonies, and then you have the father's generation who were involved in the Holocaust in some way or other, and then you have the children and grandchildren generations who are grappling with this legacy. And so there are novels like, I mean, you probably know Stefan Wackwitz, An Invisible Country, that deal with the connections between colonialism, the Holocaust, and this novel reflects a lot on hunting, which is something that all these generations do to a massive degree. The whole house in this family is covered with taxidermied animals and animal skins that are from Africa and other countries, right? And you have other novels that do this as well. Other German novels. Here's Usambara by Christoph Hamann, which embeds the discussion of the great grandfather and the colonial great grandfather and the Nazi grandfather or uncle in a sort of ecological meditation on the melting glaciers. So this is an extremely interesting genre that is just now emerging, and this is what I'm exploring right now.
That's really fascinating. And I have to admit, I was not aware, especially of that kind of ecological turn in those family sagas. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Are any of those already translated into English for our viewers?
Yeah. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So Wackwitz has been translated, and it's not that recent. And what's interesting is there's a lot written about this text in memory studies, but very few people even notice the hunting and taxidermied animal dimension. Mm-hmm. The other two are not yet translated. So there's this Usambara, Christoph Hamann, and then this is just from this year, Amanda Lasker, Berlin, Eva atmet. Eva is breathing. So
something for us to look forward to in the coming years in the literary front, and also on the scholarly front to see your work on that. So This has been a really fascinating discussion. I'm looking forward to sharing it with colleagues and students. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was great to talk. Thank you.
Thanks.